One of them spent years battling loneliness after becoming one of television's most beloved stars. Another watched fame slowly fade, while personal tragedies accumulated behind the scenes. Several cast members suffered heartbreaking losses, illness, and emotional struggles that audiences never imagined while watching them make people laugh every week. And one by one, many of the faces that defined Mass times H would eventually disappear forever. For millions of Americans, Mass times H was never just a television show. It was comfort during uncertain times. It was laughter in the middle of pain. It was a series that somehow managed to make audiences laugh and cry within the same episode. The characters felt real. The friendships felt genuine. And after 11 seasons, viewers no longer felt like they were watching actors. They felt like they were spending time with family. But behind the humor, wit, and unforgettable moments of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, real life was becoming far more complicated for the people who brought those characters to life. Because fame does not protect anyone from loss. It does not stop aging. It does not prevent heartbreak. And it certainly does not prepare someone for the day when millions of people remember them as young forever, while time quietly changes everything. Some members of the MAS times H cast found success long after the show ended. Others struggled with personal battles hidden from public view. Some carried emotional wounds for years. And several beloved stars would leave the world far sooner than fans were prepared to accept. Because the story behind MAS times H is not really about television. It is about time, friendship, loss, and the painful reality that even the most beloved television families cannot stay together forever. And by the end of this story, the legacy of Mass times H may feel even more emotional than the show itself. When Mass times H first appeared on television in 1972, nobody could have predicted what it would become. At first glance, it looked like a comedy set during the Korean War, a strange combination. Doctors telling jokes while helicopters carried wounded soldiers into camp. Surgeons making people laugh in the middle of tragedy. Humor surrounded by death. And somehow, it worked. Not only did it work, it became one of the most beloved television shows in American history. For more than a decade, audiences welcomed the doctors, nurses, and staff of the 4077th into their homes every week. Hawkeye Pierce, Bae Yao, Honeycutt, Radar O'Reilly, Colonel Potter, Margaret Holyhen, Father Mulcahy. These were not simply television characters. They became companions, friends, family. What made MAS times H different from almost every other sitcom of its era was its humanity. The show understood something deeply emotional about life. People laugh during difficult times. People joke when they are scared. People form powerful friendships when surrounded by uncertainty. And beneath all the comedy, Mass times H constantly reminded audiences how fragile life really is. That emotional honesty resonated with millions, especially during a period when America itself was struggling with questions about war, loss, and identity. Some episodes made people laugh until they cried. Others simply made them cry. And perhaps that balance is what made the series timeless. Because Mass times H never pretended life was simple. It showed joy and pain existing together, humor and grief sharing the same room, hope surviving in impossible circumstances. By the early 1980s, the cast had become part of American culture itself. The final episode drew more than 100 million viewers, becoming one of the most watched television events in history. Families gathered around their televisions knowing they were saying goodbye to something special, something that could never be recreated. And perhaps that is why MAS times H still feels so emotional today. Because for many viewers, watching the show means remembering another chapter of life. A different America, a different version of themselves, a time when Hawkeye still made them laugh, Radar still looked impossibly young, and the family at the 4077th still felt complete. But while audiences continued finding comfort in those memories, the real lives of the cast members were beginning to take very different paths. And for one actor in particular, the years after Mass times H would become a heartbreaking journey through fame, loneliness, and the painful reality of growing older in Hollywood. For millions of viewers, Alan Alda was mass times H, not just the star, not just the lead actor. He was the emotional soul of the entire series. As Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, Alda created one of the most beloved characters in television history. He was funny without being cruel, intelligent without being arrogant, compassionate without feeling sentimental, and perhaps most importantly, he felt human. Audiences trusted him, they laughed with him, they cried with him, and over 11 seasons, Hawkeye became far more than a television character. He became a friend, a familiar face people welcomed into their homes year after year. At the height of MAS times H, Alan Alda was one of the most respected actors in America. Fame surrounded him constantly. Awards followed him. Critics praised him. Viewers adored him. From the outside, it looked like the perfect Hollywood success story. But fame creates strange emotional burdens, especially when millions of people become attached to one version of you. Because no matter what Alan Alda accomplished afterward, one reality remained impossible to escape. To America, he would always be Hawkeye. And while many actors spend their lives searching for one iconic role, Alda eventually discovered the hidden downside of achieving it. The role becomes larger than the person. The audience remembers the character forever. Meanwhile, the actor continues aging, changing, growing, living an entirely different life beyond the screen. As the years passed after MAS times H ended, Alda remained successful. He worked in film, television, theater, and public speaking. Unlike many cast members, he avoided major scandals and career collapses. Yet there was still something quietly emotional about his journey. Because while audiences continued revisiting Hawkeye in reruns, Alan Alda was confronting the same reality every human being eventually faces. Time. The energetic surgeon who once sprinted through the 4077th was growing older. Friends were disappearing. Former castmates were passing away. Entire chapters of life were becoming memories. Then came another heartbreaking moment. In 2018, Alan Alda publicly revealed that he had been living with Parkinson's disease. The announcement shocked fans around the world. Not because Alda looked weak. Quite the opposite. He spoke about it with honesty, humor, and remarkable courage. The same qualities that made Hawkeye beloved decades earlier. Yet for long-time viewers, the news felt deeply personal. Because once again, audiences were forced to confront a painful truth. Their heroes were growing older, too. The man who once seemed immortal on television was now openly discussing a disease that slowly changes the body over time. And suddenly, watching old episodes of MAS times H felt different. The laughter remained. The brilliance remained. But there was now a bittersweet sadness underneath it all. Because viewers knew something Hawkeye never had to face on screen. Time eventually catches everyone. Yet what makes Alan Alda's story so powerful is not the illness. It is the grace. Instead of retreating from public life, he continued speaking, teaching, writing, and inspiring others. He refused to let the diagnosis define him completely. And, in many ways, that resilience made audiences admire him even more than they did during the height of MAS times H. Because beneath Hawkeye Pierce was a man who spent his entire life trying to understand people, connect with them, and make difficult moments feel a little less frightening. But while Alan Alda's story carries dignity and perseverance, another beloved member of the MAS times H family would leave the world far too soon. And for millions of fans, his loss would become one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the entire legacy of the show. For many fans, Radar O'Reilly was the heart of MAS times H. He was innocent in a world surrounded by war, gentle in a place filled with suffering. While other characters used sarcasm and humor to survive, Radar represented something much simpler: kindness. And perhaps that is exactly why audiences loved him so deeply. With his teddy bear, boyish smile, and uncanny ability to know what was happening before anyone else did, Radar became one of the most unforgettable characters on television. Millions of viewers felt protective of him. He seemed too pure for the chaos surrounding him, too innocent for the world he lived in. And when Gary Burghoff brought Radar to life, something extraordinary happened. The audience stopped seeing an actor. They saw Radar himself. But behind that beloved character was a man quietly struggling with the overwhelming pressure of fame. Unlike some of his castmates, Gary Burghoff never seemed comfortable with celebrity culture. While MAS times H continued becoming bigger every year, Burghoff increasingly felt trapped by the demands of television success. The long hours, the constant attention, the pressure to remain the same person audiences expected. Eventually, it became emotionally exhausting. And in one of the most surprising decisions in the history of the series, Burghoff chose to leave MAS times H before its final seasons. For viewers, the departure was heartbreaking. Radar was not supposed to leave. The family felt incomplete without him. The camp felt different. Something warm and comforting disappeared the moment he walked away. Yet for Gary Burghoff, leaving was not really about career strategy. It was about survival. He wanted more time with his family, more privacy, more control over his own life. Things fame had slowly taken away from him. But Hollywood can be unforgiving when someone walks away from a successful role. Because once audiences become attached to a character, they often struggle accepting the actor as anyone else. After MAS times H, Burghoff never experienced the same level of fame again. The giant opportunities many expected never fully arrived. And over time, he quietly faded from the spotlight. For some actors, that would have felt devastating. For Burghoff, it appeared to be a trade he was willing to make. Yet there is still something deeply bittersweet about his story, because millions of people continued loving Radar for decades. Meanwhile, the man who played him slowly disappeared from public attention almost entirely, not because audiences stopped caring, but because he chose a different path, a quieter path, a more private life. And perhaps that decision says something profound about fame itself. Sometimes success is not staying in the spotlight. Sometimes success is finding the courage to leave it. Today, whenever fans revisit MAS times H, they still smile when Radar appears on screen. The innocence, the warmth, the humor, everything that made him special remains frozen in time. But seeing those old episodes now carries a touch of sadness too, because viewers know something Radar never understood back then. Nothing lasts forever. Not youth, not fame, not even families. And somehow, the next story would become even more emotional, because one member of the MAS times H family would face devastating personal losses that changed the rest of his life forever. When Mike Farrell joined MAS times H as B.J. Hunnicutt, he faced an impossible challenge. Replacing a beloved character is one of the hardest jobs in television. Audiences were still mourning the departure of Trapper John. Fans were skeptical. Some were even angry. But somehow, Farrell accomplished what very few actors ever manage. He won them over. B.J. was different from Hawkeye, different from Trapper, more grounded, more emotionally vulnerable, more connected to the idea of home. And perhaps that was exactly what viewers needed. Because while Hawkeye represented rebellion, B.J. represented longing. The longing to return home, to see family again, to reclaim a normal life. That emotional sincerity made him one of the most beloved characters on the show. But what audiences saw on screen was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, Mike Farrell carried emotional burdens that would continue long after MAS times H ended. Unlike many actors who became consumed by Hollywood, Farrell developed a deep awareness of suffering beyond the entertainment industry. As the years passed, he became heavily involved in humanitarian causes, social activism, and human rights work. And while those efforts earned respect, they also exposed him to heartbreaking realities that many celebrities never confront directly. Stories of violence, stories of injustice, stories of loss. The more he learned about the world, the harder it became to separate himself from its pain. Perhaps that emotional sensitivity was always part of who he was. After all, B.J. Hunnicutt himself was often the character most affected by the human cost of war, and in real life, Farrell seemed to carry that same empathy. Yet empathy comes with its own price. The deeper people care, the more deeply they hurt. Over the years, Farrell also experienced the quiet sadness familiar to many aging actors. Friends passed away. Former castmates disappeared. The world changed, and the family that once gathered every day at the 4077th existed only in memories and reunion photographs. One by one, the people who helped create Mass Times H began leaving. Wayne Rogers, Harry Morgan, David Ogden Stiers, others. Each loss became another reminder that the passage of time never stops. And perhaps that is what makes revisiting Mass Times H so emotional for Farrell and the surviving cast today. Because they are not simply remembering a television show. They are remembering people they genuinely loved. People they laughed with, worked with, shared life with. The audience sees nostalgia. The cast sees ghosts. And maybe that is the hidden pain inside every beloved television legacy. The viewers get to revisit the past whenever they want. The people who lived it know that the past is gone forever. Yet somehow, Mike Farrell remains one of the strongest links to the spirit that made Mass Times H special. Compassion, humanity, empathy, the belief that kindness matters even in difficult times. But while Farrell's story is filled with reflection and resilience, the next chapter belongs to a man whose loss left one of the deepest wounds in the entire MAS Times H family. And decades later, fans still struggle to talk about him without feeling emotional. For many fans, Colonel Sherman Potter felt like the father of MAS Times H, wise, steady, compassionate. At a camp surrounded by chaos, death, and uncertainty, Potter became the calm center holding everything together. When Harry Morgan joined the series, he faced enormous pressure. Replacing a beloved character is never easy. Yet somehow, he accomplished something remarkable. He did not replace Colonel Blake. He created someone entirely different, someone audiences loved just as deeply. Potter was older than most of the camp, more experienced, more patient. He represented stability, and perhaps that is why viewers became so emotionally attached to him. Because beneath the humor and military authority was a man who genuinely cared about everyone around him. The character felt authentic, warm, human, and much of that came directly from Harry Morgan himself. Behind the scenes, Morgan was known for professionalism, kindness, and a quiet generosity that made him beloved by cast and crew alike. There were no major scandals, no dramatic public meltdowns, no tabloid headlines. Instead, there was something much rarer in Hollywood. Consistency, decency, a long career built on talent rather than controversy. Yet even lives filled with dignity are not protected from loss. As the years passed, Morgan watched the world around him change. The golden era of television slowly disappeared. Friends grew older, colleagues passed away, and the show that had once defined a generation became a nostalgic memory for millions. For audiences, Colonel Potter remained frozen in time, forever riding horses, forever offering wisdom, forever looking after his family at the 4077th. But Harry Morgan continued aging, like everyone else, and perhaps that contrast becomes especially emotional when revisiting Mass Times H today. Because viewers are not simply watching characters, they are watching people who are no longer here. In 2011, Harry Morgan passed away at the age of 96. The loss felt profound, not shocking, not unexpected, just profoundly sad, because Morgan represented something increasingly rare, a kind of gentle humanity, a reminder of another generation, another America, another way of living. When news of his death spread, tributes poured in from fans who felt as though they had lost a family member, and in many ways they had. For decades, Colonel Potter had sat in living rooms across America, offering comfort, wisdom, reassurance. The character became part of people's lives, and when Harry Morgan left the world, a piece of MAS Times H left with him. But perhaps the saddest realization came afterward. Fans began noticing how many members of the original cast were now gone. One by one, familiar faces were disappearing. The family was getting smaller. The reunions were becoming quieter. And suddenly, the passage of time that Mass Times H explored so beautifully on screen was becoming impossible to ignore in real life. Yet somehow, an even more emotional story was still waiting. Because one actor carried a tragedy so devastating, so personal, that it forever changed the way many fans viewed the legacy of Mass Times H itself. And for countless viewers, it remains the most heartbreaking chapter of all. For many viewers, Major Charles Emerson Winchester III began as someone easy to dislike, arrogant, proud, distant, the kind of character who seemed completely different from the warm, chaotic family of the 4077th. But over time, something unexpected happened. Charles Winchester became one of the most emotionally complex characters in all of Mass Times H, because beneath the arrogance was loneliness, beneath the confidence was vulnerability, and beneath the sophistication was a man desperately trying to protect himself from pain. David Ogden Stiers understood that better than anyone. His performance transformed Winchester from a simple replacement character into one of the deepest personalities the show ever created. Audiences slowly realized that Charles was not cold because he lacked compassion. He was cold because he feared showing it. And perhaps that emotional contradiction made him one of the most human characters in the entire series. Ironically, many of those same themes would follow David Ogden Stiers throughout his own life. Unlike many Hollywood celebrities, Stiers remained intensely private. He rarely sought attention, rarely chased fame, rarely seemed interested in the celebrity culture surrounding television success. Instead, he devoted himself to acting, music, voice work, and the arts. To many fans, he appeared thoughtful, reserved, almost mysterious, and perhaps that mystery only deepened as the years passed. While some cast members remained highly visible after MAS Times H, Stiers quietly built a respected career away from the spotlight. He became known to newer generations through voice acting, lending his remarkable voice to beloved animated films. Yet despite continued success, there was always something bittersweet about his story, because audiences never fully stopped seeing him as Charles Winchester, the brilliant surgeon, the outsider, the man trying to belong, and maybe that is why his later years feel so emotional looking back. As friends and colleagues from MAS Times H gradually passed away, the family that once felt eternal grew smaller and smaller. The reunions became rarer, the memories became older, and the people who once shared television history together slowly became survivors of another era. Then came the heartbreaking news. In 2018, David Ogden Stiers passed away after battling bladder cancer. He was 75 years old. For many fans, the loss felt especially painful because Stiers had always seemed timeless, intelligent, gentle, sophisticated, a steady presence, who somehow felt immune to the passage of time. But time eventually came for him too. And with his passing, another piece of Mass Times H disappeared forever. The tributes that followed revealed something beautiful. Castmates spoke not only about his talent, but about his kindness, his intelligence, his generosity, the qualities audiences rarely see behind the camera. And suddenly, the man who spent years playing an emotionally guarded character was remembered as someone deeply loved by those who truly knew him. Perhaps that is the saddest lesson hidden inside the Mass Times H legacy. The audience remembers characters. The people who worked beside them remember human beings. And as more members of the cast leave the world, those memories become increasingly precious. Yet even David Ogden Stiers' passing is not the final emotional chapter of this story, because the most heartbreaking truth about Mass Times H is not about one actor. It is about all of them, about an extraordinary family slowly disappearing with time. And that realization makes the final legacy of Mass Times H more emotional than anything the writers ever put on screen. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the Mass Times H story is not any single tragedy, not one death, not one illness, not one goodbye. It is the realization that the family audiences loved so deeply could not stay together forever. For 11 years, viewers watched the people of the 4077th survive impossible circumstances together. They laughed through pain. They comforted one another through loss. They built friendships that seemed unbreakable. And because the chemistry felt so genuine, many fans believed those bonds would somehow last forever. But real life rarely works that way. The years passed. The cast grew older. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Entire decades disappeared almost without anyone noticing, and slowly the Mass Times H family began shrinking. McLean Stevenson, Larry Linville, Harry Morgan, David Ogden Stiers, Wayne Rogers, one by one, familiar faces left the world behind. Each loss felt personal, not only for the surviving cast members, for the audience too. Because people were not simply losing actors. They were losing pieces of their own memories, pieces of childhood, pieces of family history, pieces of another America. That emotional connection became especially powerful during cast reunions. Whenever surviving members gathered together, audiences could immediately see something heartbreaking in their faces. Joy, gratitude, and sadness. The joy of seeing old friends again. The gratitude of having shared something extraordinary, and the sadness of knowing how many people were missing from the room. Every reunion became a reminder that time had won. The young doctors were no longer young. The nurses had grown older. The camp that once felt alive existed only in memories and reruns. Yet somehow, that reality made Maz times H even more meaningful, because the show was never truly about war. It was about people, about friendship, about surviving difficult times together, about finding laughter in the middle of pain. And perhaps that is why the series continues touching audiences decades later. The stories still feel human. The emotions still feel real. The friendships still feel authentic. In a world that changes constantly, Mass Times H reminds people of something timeless. Life is fragile. Time moves quickly, and the people we love will not always be here, which is exactly why those relationships matter so much. And perhaps that truth leads directly into the final chapter of the MAS Times H legacy. Because what remains today is not the ratings, not the awards, not the records. What remains is something far more powerful. The memories. Today, decades after the final helicopter lifted off from the 4077th, Mass Times H remains something very few television shows ever become. A memory, a comfort, a companion. For millions of Americans, the series is no longer simply a television show about doctors during the Korean War. It has become a reminder of another chapter of life, a reminder of parents who are gone, friends who drifted away, families who once gathered together in living rooms to watch stories that made them laugh and cry at the same time. And perhaps that is why MAS Times H feels even more emotional now than it did when it originally aired. Because the audience grew older alongside the cast. Alan Alda is no longer the young Hawkeye racing through camp with endless energy. Gary Burghoff is no longer the innocent radar everyone wanted to protect. Mike Farrell is no longer the young surgeon dreaming about returning home. The faces changed. The years passed. And many beloved members of the MAS Times H family are no longer here. Yet somehow, whenever an old episode begins, none of that seems to matter. For a brief moment, the camp comes alive again. Hawkeye is making jokes. Radar is delivering messages. Colonel Potter is offering wisdom. BJ is talking about home. And the family feels complete once more. That may be the most beautiful part of the MAS Times H legacy. Time took many things away. But it never took away the connection people felt to those characters. It never erased the laughter. It never erased the friendships. It never erased the humanity that made the series so unforgettable. Because beneath the comedy, beneath the war stories, beneath the nostalgia, Mass Times H understood something profound about life. People survive because of each other. People heal because of each other. And the memories we create together often outlive us all. Today, only a handful of the original stars remain. The reunions are smaller. The voices are older. The photographs carry more memories than ever before. But the legacy endures. Not through awards, not through ratings, not through television history. Through people, through generations of viewers who still find comfort in the 4077th, who still laugh at Hawkeye's jokes, who still feel emotional when the final episode ends, and who still remember exactly where they were when they first met this extraordinary television family. The war ended. The camp disappeared. The cast grew older, and many are gone, but somewhere tonight, someone will watch MAS times H again. And for a little while, the helicopters will return. The laughter will return. The family will return. And the memories will never leave the 4077th.